Well, John, it's really great to see you today. Quite extraordinary circumstances, I think, since we last had a cup of tea one afternoon a few years ago. Who would have thought this would be happening?
Well, it is a very different world, and we're all learning how to use Zoom and Skype. I suspect that they're just some of the ways in which the world will change forever, frankly.
As I've said to you, what we're going to talk about today is really about how we get out of the mess that we're in, and it's an economic mess. And probably just up front, I'd say that what often gets lost is the economy is about people. It's about livelihoods. It's about relationships. And yes, we've had to protect life, and the health and safety of the community during this whole thing. But, I really do think that we've got an urgent need now to focus on looking after people through a rebuilt economy. So this afternoon, I've got some sort of key headline points here in terms of areas we could talk in education, economy and the environment. But perhaps we should start more with a couple of the controversial or topical issues of the day. I suppose the first one is Virgin. So I've gone out on an end of a creaky branch this afternoon, and quite unusually for me, and said, well, I think there might be a role for government in actually ensuring that it doesn't fall over, but not for the long term, of course. And I'm just interested as a former regional representative of what your views are.
Well, I was Transport Minister and in fact was Acting Prime Minister when Ansett failed. And people are making the obvious comparisons. There's some value in that. It was owned by a foreign airline. Virgin is mostly foreign owned. It had been in trouble for some time. That is to some extent true of the Virgin group of companies as well. It's a good and needed service, so was Ansett. But the view we took at the time was that there was a limit to how much you could ask the taxpayer to do, and that in fact at that time, letting Ansett go, and we did look after the workers. You wouldn't know it from the way some of the unions have talked, but we did. And it's worth remembering this, Campbell. In a survey of the Australian people, 95% believed that it was not the government's fault and that the government should not have done anything with taxpayers' money for Ansett beyond what we did do. We had overwhelming, the clearest support I've ever seen in one of those surveys for the course of action that we took. The result was, in many ways, a boon to the travelling public because more people were able to fly for less than had ever done so before, particularly between the capital cities. This time's a bit different. Qantas plays a pretty tough game. They have benefited, of course, from a massive write-down of their own capitalisation. Not a lot of new planes coming through. The collapse in fuel prices have helped them. So they were in a stronger position than Virgin when this began. But look, personally, I have quite a bit of confidence in the team that looks as though it's going to take this through the administrative process. I believe an airline can and should emerge out of this. And I think that is something that the government should be prepared to try and facilitate. And I think they've indicated that they will.
I guess where I'm coming from is that, I'm the last one who wants government to be involved in any business enterprise, particularly an airline. I just think in these circumstances, for the regions, for tourism, for the jobs and just these flow-on effects at this time when we've got an overall economic crisis, I think government's got to look at stepping in. But by the way, only after the shareholders wouldn't be getting a cent, and I think the bankers might have to take a haircut as well. But if there was a hard bargain, government came in for 4 or 5 years with a clear, sort of stated policy of exiting after the thing is, divesting, maybe that's the way to go. But they've got to play hard ball. I don't think any suggestion of writing out cheques and just being a soft touch. I think that'd be anathema to yours truly anyway.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think we're at one on that. And I think that, as I understand it, Nicholas Moore will be heading up the Deloitte's team. Now, Nicholas Moore is, of course, of Macquarie Bank fame. And I have a huge respect for him. I think he would be one of those rare people who can maximise the opportunities, and I wish him well with it.
Oh, there's another angle too I neglected to say. I was just on the back of an envelope sort of it's a bit hard to get the right sort of figure, but if you assume 16,000 Virgin workers, another 10,000 immediately affected people who've suddenly gone on to sort of the job seeker or job keeper, that's a pretty hefty bill. Back of an envelope, you're getting orders of magnitude of $1 billion a year. So there's some offsets as well to any action. Anyway, we probably want to move on. The lockdown. I'm a fairly rebellious individual, believe it or not, and I can't wait for it'd be urging for things to ease up. But how are you seeing it?
Look, I have a great admiration for the way the Australian government has handled this, but there are so many things I'd want to say about this that I hardly know where to start, Campbell. We need to be really, really busting out the bit, so to speak, to get people back to work as soon as possible, industry by industry, region by region, however it has to be. And I have every confidence the Prime Minister will seek to do that. But there'll be some incredibly important lessons to learn out of this. You see, I don't see this as an unforeseeable crisis. I mean, I don't pretend to be clever enough to have seen there was going to be a coronavirus, but it was always going to be the case that there would be another nasty economic shock after the GFC. There just is. History tells you there will be. The world was not prepared economically. The world is very, very vulnerable. We solved the most serious debt crisis the world had probably ever seen with a whole heap more debt. Most countries went into this incident with double the debt loadings on taxpayer debt loadings that they had at the beginning of the GFC. Double. So you could say America before this had a debt to GDP of maybe 40, 50%. They were close to 100% before this. Now they borrowed, another 3 trillion over and above the couple of trillion deficit they were going to run this year. The British and European outlook is just as bad. We, of course, have gone from a situation where we had zero public sector debt at Commonwealth level and money in the bank in 2007 to one where we crept back up to around 20% debt to GDP. Now we're on the way, let's face it, to somewhere probably 50 or 60% by the time this is over. They are big numbers. So we cannot afford the need to recognise there can be no kicking the can down the road after this. There will have to be change. It's going to involve all of us. But I'll say something strange. We need to take a humble pill first. We are not as smart and clever as we think we are. We're not as in control as we think we are. We're not as good at predicting things as we think we are. We therefore need to take a leaf out of our forefathers' books and say the right thing to do is to be a little more cautious, a little less clever, pompous, and to prepare a little more wisely to provide bulwarks and fallback positions for our children and our grandchildren.
Look, I think that there's a really scary environment, particularly that's come out of this, and I'm going somewhere a bit differently than I probably indicated at the beginning, but one of the things that concerns me immediately that we're going to have to grapple with is this tension now, which is really escalating between China and the US, and indeed between many commentators in the West and the Chinese. In America right now, there's in some quarters there is this push for reparations. There are literally and quite concerningly, in my view, you've got people talking about almost reneging or defaulting on debt that the Chinese actually hold in US treasuries. And not to get into that specific as a point, but just this sort of tension, it doesn't bode well. We've all benefited, and primary producers, you're on the land, have benefited from free trade. I'd hate to see us throw the baby out with the bathwater, given the sort of the backlash against, I guess, free trade and China itself.
Look, this is one of the many important issues. I'd say there are 4, in summary, areas where we need to carefully consider things. One is we've got to restore confidence in our institutions and in our capacity to debate. We have to be able to debate properly. We have to get the best ideas on the table. We have to be honest with one another. We've got to restore respect, and we have to be prepared to say, well, governments have to lead, etc. Another area is that we've got to not abandon principles. People say, oh, it's the end of ideology, that we can throw all that away, it's just about managing for good outcomes. No, you've got to have some principles, you've got to have a framework, you've got to know what sort of society you want to be in.
Values.
Yeah, values, if you like. I'd say the third principle is we've got to work through a new and horrendous factor. It's the massive control the state can now exercise with modern technology. China's taken it to the nth degree. We've got to remember nearly everything they use to control their people is available. It's just that it's against the law and it's not held in one place in the West. But the way in which they're able to monitor their people and use everything from mobile phone technology coupled with their social credit scheme, coupled with hundreds of millions of closed-circuit televisions which are able to recognise people is horrendous. So the battle between freedom and privacy on the one hand, and safety and security and control on the other, we've got to get that one right. But then there's the one that you talk about. Sorry, I'm just trying to frame it up a bit as I see it. The one that you talk about, Campbell, I think is so important. This will create a lot of doubts in people's minds about globalisation, for good reason. We've seen some disgraceful behaviour. We really have. But if we're not careful, we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we've got to maintain international cooperation. Maybe the key is to think of our first priority as being securing vital supply chains. The obvious one here would be health. I mean, I think 80% of our pharmaceuticals come from China. How do we make certain that we're never somehow left stranded? America, I think, is 90%. So you've got a supply chain there that you've got to work through, because it's probably silly to say we should make every pharmaceutical in Australia. It probably just costs us a fortune. Be a very inefficient way of doing it, but how do we secure what we need? But another one's agriculture. Because whilst every Australian farmer, I'm told, feeds 600 others, and I'm pretty proud of that, because I'm out here on a farm at the moment, but you know, the reality is that, and our supply chains are very good. People shouldn't have been panic buying. We feed many times our own population in Australia. What's easily forgotten is that, in fact, we can't do any of that ourselves without being tapped into international supply chains. We import nearly all of our fertiliser, almost all of our fuel. We don't have our strategic oil reserves in place. Campbell, you were Premier of New South Wales, of Queensland, sorry, and those terrible floods. I'm told that we got within 3 days of running out of diesel during the peak harvest season in Australian farming sector during that time. We should have those strategic oil reserves in place. There are certain key elements we need for our chemical production that's vital to agriculture. They come out of China. So finding a balance here between rejecting globalisation and, if you like, a silly nationalisation, a nationalism, will be critically important. So there's 4 areas of really important debate coming up for us.
Okay, well, look, taking that's sort of like the strategic framework. If we now start to dive into some areas of detail, I think, you know, for me, it has to be ideally a market-led solution to some of the things you just said, some of the critical things that need to be put in place. Market-led should always be the preferred option. I go back to my comments before about Virgin. Sometimes you have to have a bit of intervention or a prod, but you know, what are the key things we should be doing then economically to try and, for example, get more manufacturing onshore, perhaps liberate energy production again in this country. You can tell I've got an agenda here I want to talk about, and to actually facilitate probably small and medium-sized enterprises who tend to work supporting those key sectors.
I think the first thing we need to do is have a much more honest debate. We'll get nowhere if we're just fighting yesterday's battles. Now, it needs to be remembered that the world's leading economists and government treasurers and finance ministers and so forth met for the World Economic Forum in Switzerland between January the 21st and the 24th. There were 3 people from Wuhan there, delegates. It was already obvious that there was a real risk of a pandemic that would smash the global economy. Was it the subject of conversation? No, it wasn't. Climate change was. That was the obsessive concern of everyone. Now, I'm not saying that's not an important issue, but I can tell you now that anybody who pretends that the Australian people think that's the only issue in town has rocks in their head. We know that there are people like Extinction Rebellion out there. I've seen one of their, I'd be interested, they might be prepared to dissociate themselves from it. But you know, there's a poster floating around ostensibly from Extinction Rebellion. It says, the problem, human beings, the solution, coronavirus. Now, that's not where people are at.
Yeah.
This crisis should remind us that we need to be a bit more fleet-footed. And my point is, to the business community, that the best thing they can do, including for climate change, is to make sure that we actually strengthen our economy, not weaken it. Now, I would say to you that the keys there are that they need strong advocacy on productivity. They need to be telling us clearly that we are simply not competitive in Australia because our energy costs have gone up there, something like triple what they average in America now, and yet America's had a better greenhouse performance than we have.
Yeah.
So don't give me the line that you can't do both. So where's the business community standing up on this? I think that will be very, very important. The virtue signalling, you know, where they've stood on popular social issues. Can I say the most important thing they can do for the Australian people now is to lead business recovery with integrity. The virtues they need to display are the old ones of prudence, of temperance, of integrity, of trustworthiness. Because a lot of their pushing of popular causes by some of the more prominent business leaders in this country, I think reflects the fact that they've been a bit on the nose. The way to win respect is not to champion public causes, but to champion what is right and important, really important, to lead the country back into a stronger financial position. Doesn't matter whether it's climate change, whether it's the next pandemic, whether it's the next global economic shock. All of them require us to have a strong economy.
I think one of the big things is the narrative within the top end of town. Yeah, in terms of this virtue signalling thing, I think that there's been very little discussion about building business, about, you know, growing and expanding and strengthening business. It's all and profitability. It's been about these other things. I think if the focus can now the focus surely now turns to the very least it's the business survival, but you know, then it's about the opportunities to grow. I mean, my late father, as you're well aware, was a Minister for National Development for a period of time, around about 77 in the Fraser government. I remember as a kid the big burst of economic progress at that time, with the coalfields really opening up. There's like a second wave after the 1960s, the 70s in the coalfields of Queensland. There was a huge expansion of iron ore mining. We saw the aluminium processing industry really get going. And that just seems to be completely absent from our sort of economic debate in the last decade. We have indeed, sort of been, in my view, stalled. We just haven't had a debate about national progress. Perhaps when people are concerned about jobs, they've seen the real spectre of unemployment. People now may be more receptive to politicians talking about building again.
That goes back in part to my comment about we need to restore confidence in our institutions and in the way we debate issues. You saw that during the last federal election. There was a view in some of the big leafy suburbs that Australia will lead with the nose on climate change, even though, unless the rest of the world comes with us, we will simply be the losers, but we'll pay for it with somebody's job out in regional Queensland. And that sort of vast gulf between Australians, I think, is a real problem. We've got to end it. We've got to have a more honest debate where people own the outcomes. But I broadly agree with you. The area where Australia can contribute most to the climate debate, I think, is in technology, but it's also probably funnily enough, in agriculture, because agriculture is a reuser and a recycler, not simply a linear producer of carbon. But the broader point that I'd want to make is there needs to be a much more sophisticated debate. It's about global outcomes. It's about how we cooperate internationally. Now, we have deindustrialised probably faster than just about any other OECD country. I don't think many Australians know that, but we have. Now, a lot of that industry's gone offshore. I think it's quite possible that, in fact, pushing those industries offshore has seen net global emissions go up, not down, while in many parts of the Australian economy, they've gone down. Now, we know that in aggregate, they've gone up a bit in Australia because of our export of gas, particularly out of Queensland. They push up our domestic figures, but they pull global figures down. It's a classic example, because they supplant other dirtier fuels. It's a classic example of where we need a more honest debate, and a debate that is more cognizant of the understandable desire of most Australians to have a job, to be able to ensure their health system works well enough that they have the ICU units in hospitals and the trained doctors and the ambulance drivers and so forth that can help them through something like a pandemic. All that stuff costs money. It depends on a strong economy. So part of the battle coming out of this, as you say, will be to revitalise business. And business, I do want to throw that challenge out there. I have the utmost respect for what business has done for the country, but people have lost confidence in recent years. And what business leaders need to do is to be the statesmen and women of old, I think, who can say, this is what the country really needs now, rather than, this is what I think you want to hear me say, so I'll say it because I know you don't like business. I think there's a lot of that going on. It's populism. We condemn politicians for it, and I say, I don't like populism, which can be defined as telling people what they want to hear, even when you know it won't work or it isn't the right solution or the best way to go. Our business leaders need to do the same. Don't start me on academia.
Well, I don't think we've got time for that. We could do a whole hour just talking about what's going on in the unis. But I'd like to come back to the climate change, carbon emissions issue in a moment. But just to dive down into a level of detail, one of the things I'm passionate about, John, is what government can do to assist small and medium-sized enterprises, and also do to get out of the way of SMEs. And I'm hoping in a subsequent interview to talk to someone whose responsibility is in this very area, that watch this space. But I have a very firm view that one of the things that politicians, whether they be state treasurers, federal treasurers, finance ministers, etc., they should be required to sit down beside a small business person and actually try and navigate their way through some of the processes. For example, to set up a business. Really, to set up a business in the country, you shouldn't have to get a consultant or a lawyer. It should be able to be done within an hour and a half in a simple, straightforward process using, obviously, information technology. To actually submit your returns, to interact with government should be straightforward. But let me give you an example. This is the bee in my bonnet. I mean, I run a funds management business these days, and really, it becomes quite exasperating the amount of time we spend trying to use government IT systems and respond to government with systems that are clunky and don't work. For example, one federal government agency that we're required to register with, it took us 3 hours over the last 3 weeks to fulfil our statutory requirement to be registered with that particular organisation. And, I might just mention the ATO, this new MyGov ID thing. Everyone I speak to has problems. I certainly have. There seem to be so many other people out there have gripes. And I just like us to do a far better job, having government actually understand the needs of business and help make it easy and simple to do what they have to do.
Look, I agree with that very strongly. I think we're in good company. Peter Costello is one of the major areas of reform that is needed in this country now. The bureaucracy involved in almost anything you want to do now is so big brotherish. It's just got right out of hand, and it is costing prosperity and jobs. I'll be a little cheeky and say that, I respect you as somebody who really sought to tackle the big issues in Queensland. But Queensland now is so top-heavy with bureaucrats and so unable to move financially because of that exploding public sector debt. But there's a challenge in what you've just said, I think, in that the New South Wales government, to its credit, has set up, I think they call it My Services, and they've actually got quite good. Going to visit the RTA in New South Wales has become a pleasure. It's extraordinary. They've trained people to really well to look at services. Now, the Commonwealth's trying to pick up that model. The alarm bells have gone off a little bit. Maybe they need, in view of what you've just said, maybe they need to have another look, because the New South Wales model does seem to be working. And you're not the first person who's said to me that the Commonwealth attempt to do the same thing isn't playing out quite as well as they would like. But this whole area of the interface between government and the community and regulation is very important. The other part of this, though, is that one of the great things I think Scott Morrison's done is this federal cabinet. I think that's a great idea. And I see talk about whether it should supplant COAG. I think that should be thought about carefully as well. I think.
Well, can I just interrupt for a second, John, on that? I agree. It's certainly working in a way that we've never seen, in our lifetimes. But provocatively, it's pretty much the same. It's the same group of people, isn't it? Isn't it just the circumstance at the time and the impetus to get this right?
Yeah, but you see, the Australian people, I think, will say, I think that all of them will pay a high price if they don't continue it on, because the Australian people, I think, will be saying, I'm sure they're saying, this has worked well, don't drop it when the end comes. We like this cooperation. We're sick of the point scoring. But the point I was going to make out of it is, you'd know very well, as a former reforming state premier, that federation needs a serious update. There are real issues going forward. Vertical fiscal imbalance, horizontal balances, the whole thing. I should fess up, I'm on a short-term committee under David Thodey with the former New Zealand Treasurer and Prime Minister Bill English, and Jane Halton, once Secretary of Health, John Fitzgerald, who's a brilliant economist, I've got terrible, I've got one of those mental blocks, wonderful lady now, Anne Toomey, constitutional expert. And we've been asked to have a whole look at this question of federalism and how it works. Actually, what's happened with coronavirus, we were kicked off 8 or 9 months ago. It's highlighted the need for us to revamp and make federalism work, because it's another area where we need to end duplication, over-regulation, increase cooperation, and recognise that whilst on the one hand the states have got to do a better job of economic management, because it's lumpy at the moment. A couple of states have been very well run, a couple have been appallingly run. On the other hand, we need something more robust going forward that delivers the services that people do need. So there's a whole area of reforms that will have to come out of this. So the government side of ensuring does its bit and leads us back into jobs and prosperity is to get the regulatory framework right and the industrial relations framework right, but also, and I think this is very, very important, the tax mix right, because we know some taxes are much more efficient than others, and in particular, income tax and value-added or GST taxes are more efficient, people hate me saying this, but it's true, you'll know it, than company taxes. They think, oh, hit the big guys. No, you don't do that, because you don't hit anybody except the people they work for. That's what's not understood about this.
I never thought I would be to this point, but given this crisis, I mean, I'm now publicly saying that I think the GST should be going up to 15%. That's just based on figures I saw some years ago about what then you could do. But we do need to see trade-offs then in terms of, company tax coming down, personal income tax should be set up so it incentivises people to have a go and the like. And we do need some of these inefficient, sort of 19th century taxes to actually go. I mean, that was meant to happen back in your time in office, but some of the states didn't really follow through with what they were meant to do. Is that actually what happened with the GST introduction?
In part, the original proposal was for a 15% GST, and stamp duty was to go to all the states.
Why don't we talk for a moment about the whole climate change thing and carbon emissions. And I might say up front, look, I've been fairly sceptical about this whole thing for some time, and I continue to have real doubts about the science. I know I'm told that the science is in, etc., but I continue to see plenty of signs that the jury is still out. Having said that, from a pragmatic point of view for our national progress, we're talking about issues to get us out of this current crisis. I've sort of come to a position at the moment that, look, bugger it, let's just come up with a political compact through that national cabinet, perhaps, where we actually end the climate wars, that we put in place something that allows business to invest with confidence, governments to make decisions and set that framework, and we move on to some other interesting political battles. But this one's been so corrosive and damaging for the last 15 years. What do you think of that? And if so, well, what might be the way forward in your view?
We have to find a way forward. But we also have to recognise, I think, that we've got to have a much more honest debate about this. We really do. Everything we do should be judged against, I believe, the question of, does it make a difference globally, because this is a global problem?
Yeah.
Are we closing down an industry in Australia for feel-good reasons, only to see it emerge somewhere else where it will create more of a problem? It's called emissions leakage. Or are we using our technological expertise to provide real answers? And I actually do think, and I'm doing a lot of work on it at the moment, not claiming to be exclusive on this, there's a lot of very clever people doing a lot of work in an area that's being overlooked. We have a huge landmass, and it is highly likely that we can do a lot more carbon sequestration simply by quite modest changes to farming practices, and making sure that land managers and farmers are properly rewarded for those changes. There's a lot of offshore money waiting to come to this country right now, right as you and I speak, particularly out of Europe, from people who are saying, if you can find ways to demonstrate clearly with simple, transparent, accessible, user-friendly science, that as a farmer you're locking up more, it's not just trees, it's pastures and it's soil management. If you can find better ways to do it, then we will invest, we will buy credits, if you like. Now that's incredibly significant, because the sheer numbers will tell you this. I'm indebted to a Queenslander, Terry McCosker, a remarkable man out of Yeppoon, who has trained many a farmer to think carefully about his own business. And he pointed out to me, now I'll probably get these figures wrong, but it'll just give you a bit of an idea of the scale of things. Anthropological activity every year, I think, emits around 9 million gigatons of carbon, which sounds unbelievable. It is completely, utterly and totally dwarfed by the amount of carbon that is held in our soils, which immediately tells you that what we do with our soils need only involve relatively modest amounts of extra absorption and retention of carbon to offset that output. Now that's an area where we do actually lead the world in the science in this area, by the way. Not many Australians would know that, but we do. The Americans are chasing us down, but we do lead in some areas. I can't believe it. We actually lead in some areas, but we never talk about it. We never talk about it. And this is one we want to get on the national agenda, because I think it can be a win-win. It can give us a better income stream for farmers. It can see them making a contribution to something that Australians believe is really important. It can become export capable. And here's a really interesting solution or aspect of this. Imagine if Australian agriculture, or even individual farmers, if you like, at that level, could say genuinely, not the steak was produced in carbon-free way because we purchased offsets, but it was actually literally produced in a way that absorbed carbon. Now, there are a lot of scientists, some would dispute, but a lot of scientists saying that's quite doable. So what's my point? I agree with you. Let's find a national consensus, but let's stop this self-loathing of our way of life and of capitalism and so forth that drives the extreme elements of it. Remember Extinction Rebellion? They held up your capital city of Brisbane in unbelievable ways. If it's not true, but I've seen a poster, maybe they can disown it if it's not true. saying the problem, humans, the solution, coronavirus. That's not where most of us are at, Campbell.
Or not. And I think, well, look, I guess I'm looking for a solution, just echoing something you just said there. I'm looking for a solution that says, hey, we actually do like living in a modern, Western, prosperous economy. We like that. We enjoy that. And we should be, yes, protecting the planet, and we should be doing what we can to deal with this and other issues, but we should be doing it in a way that is mindful of not destroying that lifestyle. So, I mean, you know, I suppose the thing that it seems to me is that we've really got to revisit, and it's been a political sort of electric fence for everybody, has been the issue of carbon pricing. Why not just, you know, adopt the carbon pricing model of some description and let the market sort it out and get on with it? Is that the way forward, perhaps? I mean, that's what I've come to, perhaps reluctantly, but that's where I think I am now in these circumstances.
I think I'd want to say I'm not quite there yet. I do want to take the issue seriously. I get that the Australian people want to, but my premier objective is a more honest debate about what Australia can and can't do. We can lead in technology, the very thing you've just said. That's what we're good at. We can't solve the global problem. We need to find a smart way through this, and we need less. You see, I actually think one of the great problems is that most people are fixated on reducing emissions because they bought the line from the people who hate capitalism that it's our lifestyle that's causing the problem. I mean, you do hear a lot of warriors from the climate change debate saying that capitalism is the problem.
Oh, that's the self-loathing, yeah.
That's the self-loathing.
Yeah.
I can't go there. What I do say is we've got to, you know, I think, again, the things that I find it staggering that we have lifted so many people out of poverty, so many people have opportunities, so many boys and girls. There's remarkably little difference now between educational opportunities for boys and girls right around the world. There's so much good news. 80% of the world's population, I'm told now, has some access to electricity. Polio, I think, has been eradicated from right across Africa. Malaria, almost. You know, we're into such self-loathing that we're in danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
I think this whole incident's told us that's not where we're at. We actually do value longevity, good health, a good lifestyle. I think these things are important to us, and I don't see a problem with them, but they do depend upon a strong economy. As you said in your opening remark, you know, economics should never be about a sweet set of numbers. Good economics is about good outcomes for people.
Absolutely.
And I don't think you can solve the global emissions problem by smashing economies. I think that'll produce a disastrous outcome.
Well, I'm conscious of your time, but just to the last few minutes, talking people, why don't we just flip to education? Because I think out of this, with the firstly disruption of the jobs market, this might well hasten the demise of, you know, various occupations and opportunities. I mean, just, you know, for example, I think a whole lot of companies have worked out that they might not need to spend as much money on airfares or indeed office space in the future. That's just one reflection. So there's the issue about, you know, people being able to step into other occupations and the like. And the other issue is just how the schools are preparing kids at the moment for the marketplace. And again, to lead with a personal view, I think, you know, one issue I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, I think there's a belief amongst a lot of teachers that sort of technology is teaching kids to be able to use one of these and a computer or whatever. But in my view, that's really missing the point. We do have to actually create, we have to educate kids so they can get into sciences and engineering. And it's not technology just be able to use an iPad. So those are some initial views. Do you see some challenges in the education sector?
I think there are massive problems. Look, the raw numbers tell you that we're falling behind globally. We should be leading globally. The outcomes in Australia's education system are not good enough. And the losers are our children. But I also think that, unfortunately, academia, the humanities in particular, have been hollowed out to a frightening degree. The debate about free speech misses what it's really about. It's diversity of views. We hear this endless call for diversity and respecting differences, but it's not genuine. Look, I'm all for STEM, strong STEM performance in Australian universities, but our humanities need to produce people who are able to think very broadly, that understand the way to a solution is to hear every point of view. The way to ensure that people own the solution is for everyone who have had their chance to have a say, to ask their questions, have those questions answered. And that feeds into something else that's very important. People decry the quality of politicians today. I'd be the first to say, I think there are many fine men and women still coming forward. But I also think that we are denying ourselves many of the best who look at it and say, I have a different view. I'm just not going to come forward though, because I'm going to get shouted down. I won't be heard. And we're paying a terrible price for that. You're seeing this terrible obsession with groupthink. And that's why I'm being really blunt. I'm very pro-business. I'm very pro-free enterprise. But I'm having a bit of shot at the business and the economics sort of professions. And I'm saying, really, you are not prepared once you saw the early warning signs in January to switch your urgent attention to the incredible impact that this was going to happen? Where were you? You're the experts, you're the trained people. Why were you not offering governments and communities more warning of what might have been coming?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was pretty obvious long before the business community, anyway, I've been over that. They need to be on the ball more. We all do, and academia does as well.
What about the TAFE sector? Any views there?
That's a really interesting question. I, as you know, have a video conversation series as well. It's on anderson.net.au. And I recently did a conversation with a remarkable man in America about his book, co-authored with an Englishman, and they're both actually from the political left. But they've written a book called The Boy Crisis. And they say everywhere in the West, we've let boys and girls down with family disintegration without wanting to particularly labour that subject at the moment, except to say this. He said, part of the other way we've let them down is we've shoved everyone we can find through universities.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people, and we've sort of said that's the prestigious thing to do. So the only Western country that hasn't done it's Japan. Now, there are other factors at play there, the demographics included. But he said they've always strongly streamed people vocationally into academia or into trades and what have you. And the figures on the number of Japanese workers who are employed in and well paid beats the West hands down in the trades. They're fully respected, fully honoured, they're good jobs to have, and you haven't got this terrible wastage. You've got an estimated 20 million working age American men who've just given up because they've been trained, but they haven't done as well as they should have and what have you. So I'm a great believer that we need to revitalise that side of our training as well. But then they've got to make sure that it is possible to build things, make things, innovate, think things through. We do need a major debate about the future of our country coming out of this, Campbell. We really do.
I guess we better wind up. We could probably talk for quite a long time, but I really appreciate you having a chat to me this afternoon, and we hope that we'll stimulate some thoughts and some debate from other people who see it. And thanks so much, John. It's been great to have a chat. Yeah.
And you. Look forward to the time when we can actually get together for a coffee.